Welcome back to The Explainer. We're jumping right in today and we're unlocking the heavy doors of a place whose very name tends to send a shiver down the spine of the British public, Broadmoor. But as I was exploring the source material for this, I realized pretty quickly that we aren't walking into a dungeon here. Broadmoor is actually a highly complex, high security NHS psychiatric hospital in Berkshire. Now, yes, it absolutely houses some of the United Kingdom's most violent and mentally ill men, but the reality inside these walls is vastly different and honestly deeply human compared to the terrifying headlines we're all used to seeing. Okay, let's dive into this. The public perception of Broadmoor is heavily skewed by the tabloids. I mean, it's widely seen as a dumping ground for the country's absolute worst monsters. But the staff working on the ground offer a completely different perspective. They point out that, sure, the easiest reaction in the world is to see atrocious acts, label those individuals as pure evil, and just want to lock the door and throw away the key. It's a totally natural reflex reaction to horrendous crimes. But Broadmoor exists because the truth is so much more complicated. The men here aren't just criminals, they're patients. If we really break down the myth versus the reality, the starkest difference is the very nature of the institution itself. A prison fundamentally has a punishing function, right? It comes with a set release date. Broadmoor, on the other hand, is a hospital. It has a therapeutic function for men whose crimes, which range anywhere from arson to murder, are driven by severe psychological disorders. And here's the real catch. Patients here have absolutely no set release dates. None. They are here until they are no longer deemed a grave risk to society. For some of these guys, that means decades. For others, it literally means a lifetime. And as you might guess, achieving that level of intensive, round-the-clock psychiatric care, it does not come cheap. The financial toll is staggering. We're talking £300,000. That is the yearly cost to keep just one single patient at Broadmoor. To put that into perspective for you, that's almost 5 times the cost of keeping someone in a standard prison. This astronomical figure really reflects the kind of hypervigilant, highly specialized care required to treat conditions this complex. Section 1. Perpetrators and victims, the roots of violence. And this brilliantly illustrates why that care is so intensely specialized. We have to look at the dark, tangled roots of the patient's violence. These severe disorders don't just spring up out of nowhere. What I found really eye-opening in the sources is that these conditions are so often the tragic harvest of horrifying, deeply ingrained histories of trauma. Just look at these dual realities for a second. On one hand, you have a convicted arsonist and kidnapper, but that exact same man was born into satanic abuse, literally locked in an attic and starved as a child. Or you have a convicted killer, who is actually a deeply vulnerable runaway groomed and pulled into street gangs. Or a hostage taker who suffered systemic physical and sexual abuse while living in the state's care homes. Which leads us to a pretty profound realization from the care workers. Every single day, they are forced to hold 2 completely conflicting truths at once. These men are absolutely perpetrators of horrific, inexcusable violence. That's a fact. But they are also victims of the most profound trauma imaginable. Recognizing that doesn't erase or excuse their crimes, not at all, but it does humanize the men that society has branded as monsters. And frankly, it provides the only real, functional roadmap for their psychological treatment. Section 2. Security versus Therapy, the Broadmoor Balancing Act. So how do you actually go about treating someone who could violently turn on you at literally any second? You can't exactly conduct effective therapy if the therapist is dead or injured. And that creates this massive, constant tension between security and therapy. To really grasp the hypervigilance required on the wards, just think about everyday items. To you and me, a CD or a plastic spoon is totally harmless, right? Well, in Broadmoor, a CD gets snapped into shards to make razor blades. A plastic spoon is melted down and sharpened into a stabbing weapon. Even something as mundane as an MP3 player wire becomes a ligature for severe self-harm. Literally every single item in the facility has to be strictly monitored and counted. And when that threat level inevitably boils over, the physical interventions are extreme. Just moving an uncooperative patient requires a full 8-person restraint protocol. It is highly mechanical and it is forceful. They secure the thrashing patient to the floor, lift them strictly by the ankles and knees so they can't kick, place them face down on a bed, and then the staff have to exit the room one by one. The staff member tasked with holding the patient's head is always, absolutely, the last to leave, backing out quickly just to avoid taking a final blow. It really proves just how dangerous even routine movements on these wards can be. But physical force is really the last resort. What I found absolutely fascinating as I dug into this was their primary safety net, something they call relational security.
Staff actually maintain safety by relying on their deep, intuitive knowledge of the patients themselves. They'll notice if a normally quiet guy is suddenly laughing inappropriately, or if a patient is quietly sitting there counting the number of staff members in the room, which is a sure sign they are calculating the odds of a successful attack. It's all about predicting and de-escalating that violence long before it ever happens.
But before any kind of deep, meaningful therapy can even begin, the patient's mind has to be stabilized. And that brings up a massive, controversial area of conflict: medication. For the doctors, forced medication is simply necessary. It stops terrifying auditory hallucinations and dampens psychosis. But for the patients, it often feels like pure torment. They experience massive weight gain, completely deadened emotions, and this awful feeling of being chemically straitjacketed or mentally disabled. Because of those agonizing side effects, they often violently refuse it, which makes the initial stages of treatment incredibly fraught.
Section 3. Snakes and Ladders. Navigating the wards.
Once a patient is somewhat stabilized, they begin a journey that the staff actually liken to a giant, incredibly precarious game of snakes and ladders. A patient starts down in intensive care, where, by the way, it takes 6 staff members just to unlock a single door. As they slowly prove a reduction in violence, they climb the ladder to admissions, then up to high dependency for structured routines, and eventually to assertive rehab, where they might actually earn a key to their own room and start cooking their own meals. The ultimate goal, way over on the far right of this journey, getting transferred out to a lower security regional secure unit.
So the crucial point is that this timeline does not move at normal speed. As they say on the wards, there's time and then there's Broadmoor time. And remember that snakes and ladders metaphor? A patient can spend 4 grueling years earning their way up to a rehab ward, but a single psychotic relapse or just one incident of self-harm acts as a snake that slides them instantly back to square one in intensive care. Decades of progress can vanish in an afternoon. Section 4. The Long Road Out. Breaking the Chain.
So what does it look like when the treatment actually starts to stick? The ultimate goal, obviously, is rehabilitation and recovery, but we need to understand that this isn't some sudden cinematic breakthrough. Recovery here looks like a patient voluntarily accepting a medication injection instead of fighting 8 nurses for it. It looks like a young man channeling crippling, violent guilt into highly detailed charcoal self-portraits. It's the monumental, almost unimaginable victory of a man slicing a mango to make a fruit salad while actively ignoring the auditory hallucinations screaming at him to launch a knife attack. These seemingly tiny, everyday moments, for these severely traumatized men, they are colossal victories of willpower. And for some of them, that slow, incredibly grinding work actually pays off. After years and sometimes literally decades of intensive therapy, heavy medication, and relational security, a few patients do successfully earn a conditional discharge. As one patient proudly stated after winning his medical tribunal, "I've broken the chain. Broadmoor served its purpose. I don't need you now." It is a rare but undeniably hopeful reality that some of these deeply traumatized individuals can actually learn to safely manage their illnesses. Which really leaves us with this final, incredibly difficult thought. Broadmoor takes the men that society has essentially thrown away, the ones branded forever as monsters, and the staff work tirelessly to rebuild them. But if and when that monumental task is actually complete and a patient is finally deemed rehabilitated, is the public actually ready to forgive them? Are we ready to let them back into society? It's a question that challenges every single preconceived bias we hold. Thank you so much for joining.